They called themselves the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. To the outside world, they were an elite unit, the tip of the Nazi spear, molded in fanatic loyalty and brutality. To those who faced them on the battlefield, they were something else entirely, the Devil's Own Division. Formed from Hitler's personal bodyguards, the Leibstandarte grew into a hardened army of true believers. They didn't fight for land or honor, they fought for an idea that the world would kneel to their Führer. By 1943, they were no longer men. They were symbols of fear, wrapped in black uniforms and armed with blind devotion. But symbols don't bleed, soldiers do. And on the Eastern Front, the Red Army was learning how to make even devils bleed. The Soviets had heard stories of the Waffen-SS villages whispered about massacres left behind in their retreat. When word spread that the Leibstandarte was moving east again, Soviet commanders issued a simple order: no mercy. To them, this wasn't war, it was retribution. The first clashes came on the frozen plains of Kharkov. Soviet soldiers advancing through snow-choked fields met an enemy unlike any they had seen. The Leibstandarte fought with a terrifying precision, ambushing tank columns, burning villages to ash and executing prisoners on the spot. For a moment, it seemed the Red Army's momentum would break, but beneath the chaos, the Soviet war machine was evolving. They learned, adapted, and hardened. Every battle with the Waffen-SS became a lesson in how to kill faster, smarter, colder. By summer 1943, both armies converged near a quiet town called Kursk. There, the Devil's Division prepared for the largest tank battle in human history. They believed their Tigers and Panthers were invincible, their training unmatched, their faith unshakable. But faith cannot stop steel. When the Red Army launched Operation Citadel, the earth itself seemed to explode. Thousands of guns roared at once. The sky turned black with smoke and dust. Inside the inferno, Soviet infantry crawled through the mud beneath tanks, planting explosives by hand. Whole regiments vanished in minutes. The Leibstandarte, surrounded by fire, kept fighting, disciplined, methodical, relentless. But the Soviets had numbers, factories, and fury on their side. Every SS tank destroyed was replaced by 3 Soviet ones. Every dead German was answered with 10 Soviet volunteers shouting, "Za Rodinu," for the motherland. By the 7th day, the Devil's Division was bleeding out. Their black uniforms were unrecognizable, burned, torn, soaked in mud. The men who once saw themselves as the chosen warriors of the Reich now fought just to survive. And for the first time, cracks appeared in their discipline. They began to understand what the Soviets already knew. The war in the East was no longer about tactics or glory. It was about who could endure the most suffering. When the Battle of Kursk finally ended, the Leibstandarte was shattered. Of the 20,000 men who entered the fight, more than half were gone. Their tanks lay twisted in the fields. Their officers were dead or wounded. Even their commander, Sepp Dietrich, admitted in a rare moment of honesty, "We met an enemy that cannot be broken." The Red Army didn't pause to celebrate. To them, this was only the beginning. They would hunt the Devil's Division across every river and forest until nothing remained. Reports from Soviet scouts described seeing SS bodies strung up by partisans, burned convoys, and abandoned weapons scattered for miles. The myth of invincibility was dead, and once a myth dies, its believers crumble. Yet amid the destruction, the surviving SS soldiers still clung to their ideology. They swore they would return, rebuild, and redeem the honor of their unit. But the Soviet command had already made its decision. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler would never rise again. They would be erased from the war, not captured, not tried, but annihilated. As winter 1943 descended, Soviet divisions moved westward with one goal: to hunt the Devil's men wherever they ran. Villages burned again, but this time under the banner of vengeance. The Red Army carried no pity, only memory. Behind every rifle shot was the ghost of a family lost, a city destroyed, a child buried under rubble. For the Soviets, this wasn't just another campaign, it was the cleansing fire of history. In the distance, as snow fell on the bodies scattered across the steppe, the wind carried a whisper through the ruins. The devil came east, and here he died. The winter of 1943 came early, and with it the sound of vengeance. The Leibstandarte had barely escaped from Kursk when the Red Army came roaring after them, not with rage, but with purpose. Soviet generals didn't want victory, they wanted erasure. The order was clear: destroy the Waffen-SS wherever found. None are to leave the East alive. By now, the once elite division was no longer a force of gods, but of ghosts. Their tanks sputtered in the cold, their fuel was low, and their faith was breaking. The men who once laughed at death now watched the endless Soviet artillery flashes with quiet dread. They called it Stalin's lightning. Each shell carved another wound in their myth. As the Soviets advanced, the front collapsed. Whole German formations disappeared overnight, swallowed by the red tide of infantry and steel. The Leibstandarte fought rearguard actions along the Dnieper River, trying to buy time for the retreating Wehrmacht. But time was a luxury the East would no longer give. Villages turned to ash as the Red Army closed in. The frozen roads were lined with wrecked panzers, their crews burned alive inside. Survivors trudged through the snow, their black uniforms now grey with frost and soot. The Soviets had learned the enemy's every move. They no longer attacked blindly. They encircled, cut off supplies, then let hunger finish what bullets could not. And as the German lines thinned, partisan fighters struck from the forests, ambushing convoys, cutting communications, spreading terror. For the Leibstandarte, the Eastern Front had become a maze of death. Inside Soviet command tents, the name Leibstandarte carried a different weight now. It was not spoken with fear, but with calculation. They had maps marked with skulls, each representing a massacre the SS had committed. For every skull, a new offensive was planned. This was not just military strategy, it was justice written in artillery fire. In early 1944, the Red Army launched a coordinated strike across Ukraine. The Leibstandarte, already reduced to fragments, found itself cornered near the city of Vinnytsia. There, amid the ruins and snow, they faced the full wrath of Soviet armor, columns of T-34s rolling like thunder through the fog. The battle lasted 2 days. By the third, the Germans were out of ammunition. Machine guns clicked empty. Soldiers fought with knives, shovels, bare hands. When it was over, the snow was black with oil and blood. Soviet soldiers walked among the dead in silence. No mercy, no pity. Only the cold satisfaction that the devil's men were finally dying. But even as the Leibstandarte crumbled, the Nazi propaganda machine refused to admit defeat. Berlin radio claimed, "Our brave SS divisions stand firm against Bolshevik hordes." In reality, those divisions were corpses buried under ice. The truth was hidden from the German people, but not from the front lines where survivors whispered, "The East devours everything." For the Red Army, the destruction of the Waffen-SS had become personal. Many officers had lost families to these same soldiers. When they captured an SS insignia, they didn't keep it as a trophy, they burned it. When prisoners were taken, they were rarely sent west. The front was their grave. To fight the Devil's Division was to look into the eyes of the war's darkest soul and to pull the trigger without hesitation. The few who survived spoke later of a nightmare that never ended. They remembered nights lit only by burning tanks and the scream of Katyusha rockets. They remembered how the ground shook under the Soviet advance, how the air smelled of iron and death, and they remembered the faces of the Red Army soldiers, blank, determined, unstoppable. By spring, the Leibstandarte no longer existed as a division. It was a name on a roster, a memory fading under the march of 1,000,000 boots. The Soviet High Command crossed it off their lists, satisfied that one of Hitler's greatest monsters was gone. But for the Red Army soldiers who stood over those frozen fields, victory felt hollow. No victory could bring back what had been lost. No vengeance could fill the graves stretching from Stalingrad to Kiev. As the sun set over the blackened snow, a Soviet officer wrote in his journal, "They called themselves the Devil's Men, but we learned that even the devil dies when faced with fire strong enough. The fire still burned, and it was moving west." The winter of 1944 turned to mud, and with it, the Eastern Front began to dissolve. The once feared Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Devil's Division, was now little more than a shadow limping westward. Their tanks were burned out husks, their officers dead or delirious. Every road they took was already marked by Soviet artillery fire, and every field was haunted by ghosts of the men who'd once believed they were invincible. For the Red Army, the chase had become a ritual. They didn't fight the Waffen-SS anymore, they hunted them. Each village liberated brought reports of atrocities, civilians executed, towns razed, children taken as human shields. The Soviets didn't forget. They kept lists, names, dates, crimes. The war might one day end, but for these men there would be no forgiveness. As the Red Army pushed deeper into Ukraine and Poland, the remnants of the Leibstandarte were thrown into one hopeless defense after another. At Kovel, they tried to hold the line with barely 100 tanks. At Brody, they were surrounded entirely. Some units fought until their ammunition ran dry. Others simply vanished into the forests, hunted down by partisans who knew no mercy. Even the SS officers, once proud symbols of Nazi might, began discarding their uniforms, smearing mud on their faces to hide the insignia that marked them for death. The Soviets didn't take prisoners easily. They had seen too much, lost too much. A captured SS man wasn't a soldier in their eyes, he was a murderer. One Soviet commander later wrote, "We did not execute them. We simply left them where they fell." Behind the front lines, Soviet war correspondents filmed the ruins left in the SS's wake, mass graves, burned barns, the remains of families buried in shallow pits. These films would later play in Moscow theaters, not as propaganda, but as proof. Proof that vengeance was justice. Proof that the fire consuming the East was righteous. By now, even the German High Command understood the truth. The Waffen-SS divisions on the Eastern Front were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Leibstandarte, Hitler's first and most loyal creation, was no longer an army. It was a myth being erased, one corpse at a time, but Hitler refused to accept it. He ordered the division rebuilt, reinforcements, new tanks, fresh uniforms, as if symbols could stop the Soviet tide. The survivors who returned from the front knew better. They had seen what the Red Army had become, not a mob, not a wave, but a storm. The Soviets no longer feared the SS, they despised them. Each encounter was a reckoning, each battlefield became a tomb. When the Leibstandarte was pulled back to defend Hungary in early 1945, its numbers were so depleted that entire regiments existed only on paper, but Hitler demanded one last stand. The division was thrown into Operation Frühlingserwachen, the Spring Awakening, his final desperate attempt to save the collapsing Reich. It was madness. Mud swallowed tanks whole, fuel ran out before the first offensive even began, and Soviet artillery waited for them like wolves in the dark. In less than a week, the operation collapsed. The Leibstandarte was annihilated again, the Devil's Division dying its second death. For the Soviets, this was poetic justice. They had watched this same division slaughter innocents in Kharkov and Kiev. Now they watched its black insignia disappear beneath the mud of Hungary. One Soviet soldier, writing to his wife, said simply, "I saw the ones who burned our villages. I saw them kneel before fire." The retreat westward became a funeral march. Columns of broken SS soldiers trudged toward Austria, pursued by Soviet tanks that never stopped moving. The Red Army had no reason to slow down now. Berlin was the next prize. And for every Soviet soldier, the memory of what the SS had done burned behind their eyes. They would take the capital, and they would make sure the Devil's Division was buried beneath it. In those final months, the Leibstandarte was no longer feared. It was pitied. Its fanatical core had been shattered, its veterans too exhausted to believe in victory. They had become the walking dead, soldiers fighting not for Hitler, not for Germany, but because surrender meant execution. Every step west was another denial of fate, but fate was patient, and the Soviets were closer every day. By April 1945, as the Red Army prepared to storm Berlin, only fragments of the Leibstandarte remained. The Devil's Banner, the black standard once paraded before Hitler himself, was gone. No one knew where it fell. Some said it burned in the fields outside Vienna. Others claimed it was trampled into the mud near Lake Balaton. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it would never rise again. In the ruins of the East, the snow melted to reveal thousands of corpses, soldiers, civilians, the remains of a division that once called itself immortal. And among them, silence. For the first time since the war began, the Devil's Division had nothing left to say. Berlin was burning. The night sky glowed orange as entire districts turned to ash. The once proud Reich had become a dying empire, choking on its own smoke. And somewhere in that inferno, the last remnants of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Devil's Division, waited for their final hour. They were barely 1,000 men now, exhausted, wounded, half-starved, and surrounded. Their black uniforms, once symbols of power and fear, were tattered rags coated in soot. Yet they still clung to their orders, defend Berlin to the last bullet. For them, there was no escape. They had lived by Hitler's madness. Now they would die with it. As Soviet artillery thundered across the city, the ground itself seemed to tremble. Every building collapsed like paper. Every street became a river of debris. The Red Army had come not just to conquer, but to end the nightmare that had consumed their homeland. And they knew exactly who they were looking for. Inside the city, the last SS troops prepared for street-to-street combat. They had no tanks left, only a handful of Panzerfausts and courage born of desperation. Against them came the 3rd Shock Army and the 8th Guards, veterans of Stalingrad, Kursk, and the long, brutal march from the Volga. They had chased the Devil's Division across half of Europe, and now they were ready to finish the hunt. The fighting was savage beyond imagination. Soviet soldiers stormed buildings room by room, using flamethrowers and grenades to flush out SS resistance. Machine gun nests were buried under rubble. Basements became tombs. Every corner held another ambush, another death. But the Soviets kept moving forward, step by step, fueled by something deeper than hatred, justice. In the government district, where the last SS units made their stand, the world seemed to end. Flames lit up the night as Soviet Katyusha rockets screamed overhead. The air was filled with dust and screams, the smell of burning fuel and blood. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was judgment, and the judgment was absolute. Some of the surviving SS officers tried to surrender, waving torn white flags from the ruins, but most were shot where they stood. The Red Army had seen too much to forgive. They remembered the villages of Ukraine, the prisons of Smolensk, the ashes of Stalingrad. This was the reckoning they had carried in their hearts since 1941. By the time Soviet troops reached the Reich Chancellery, the Devil's Division was gone. A handful of men still fought in the corridors, their faces blackened by smoke, shouting oaths to a Führer who was already dead. The Soviets didn't bother to take them prisoner. The roar of flamethrowers drowned out their last words. When silence finally fell over Berlin, it was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of exhaustion. The war was over, but the memory would never fade. The Red Army had not just defeated an enemy, it had erased a symbol. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Devil's Division, had been annihilated, body and soul. In the aftermath, Soviet officers walked through the ruins, searching for survivors. Among the debris, they found fragments of SS insignia, melted medals, and half-burned photographs. There was no glory here, only ruin. A Soviet sergeant, standing amid the wreckage, said quietly, "They wanted to be gods. But even gods bleed when the world turns against them." When the war ended, the name Leibstandarte was erased from official German records. Its survivors, the few who managed to flee west, tried to reinvent themselves as soldiers, not murderers. But history remembered. The Soviets made sure of it. Every archive, every testimony, every burned village told the same story, how the Devil's Division met its end in the fire it had once unleashed. And as the red flag rose above the Reichstag, fluttering in the smoky dawn, it was more than a symbol of victory. It was a promise that those who bring hell to the world will one day burn in it. For years afterward, Soviet veterans would speak of that day, not with triumph, but with gravity. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as survivors of a storm that had consumed everything, even the men who started it. And somewhere, buried deep beneath the ruins of Berlin, lay the final truth of the Devil's Division. Fanaticism can build armies, but only humanity can win wars. The devil had come east in fire, and in fire he perished.